Hello and welcome back to the Innovate Eco podcast. I'm your host, Rob Bragglesworth, and this is the podcast where I interview founders of planet positive businesses who are taking direct action to tackle various environmental problems that we face. Now, in today's episode, I speak to Cameron Dowd, who's the co-founder of the company Inverto. Now, Inverto are connecting businesses to local communities to help plan, plant, and restore coastal ecosystems. In this episode, we talk about how they're doing that, how the business is forming, and how the mission is evolving. We talk about Cameron's background in robotics and how he started working with drones in Tanzania, flying medical supplies. We also talk about things like carbon tunnel vision and also everything around building a business in this space and the challenges that come along with it, which is the main focus of this podcast. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode, and here's my interview with Cameron Dowd from Inverto. So Cameron, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much, Rob.
So I've been doing a little bit of research on your background, and it feels that you've got quite a fascinating story arc to where you are today. Just looking at some of the bits and bobs that you've sent over, and I think a good place to start potentially, and tell me if I'm wrong, but where I think would be a good place to start is with your work in Tanzania when you were working for a drone startup out there. And yeah, could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up doing that work and how that eventually ended up starting to join the dots towards where you are and what you're working on today?
Sure. Yeah. That was definitely, probably one of the more interesting jobs I had. Essentially, so I'd studied originally in Australia mechanical engineering, and then I went to study in Switzerland, again, mechanical engineering, but then I got pulled into a bit the drones and robotics space. And from that, did some of my master thesis on drones and things, and then I applied as a first employee of a startup in Germany called Wingcopter. They're quite big actually these days, but it's a typical startup story. Back then it was just a small group of people, and their first kind of big project was delivering medical supplies essentially on Lake Victoria in Tanzania, so from the mainland out to an island. Super interesting project. It really got me excited to not just have a kind of job, the normal kind of tech job. I could actually do something, see the impact it was having. And then the really cool thing was actually going out there and seeing it in action and seeing it actually having a positive impact on the world. That ticked all my boxes in terms of a job straight out of university. And from that, I don't think I could ever go back to the standard kind of office job, which I did a bit of in the past, but I guess I was a bit spoiled with that. It's a super interesting project. So this was back in 2017 or so, and that was just kind of the beginning of this hype around drones and using them for, in surveying and things. They were actually being used, but it wasn't as sexy, let's say, as hyped. And drone delivery was a bit the thing that everyone was excited about. Amazon was starting on that, Google was starting on that, and so also Wingcopter they're still in the game. And so this, I can't say I'm always convinced of the use case for drone delivery, I would say, after having seen it all around the place now. But this is one of the ones where it can make sense. The normal way out to this island is you take like a 3-4 hour ferry. There's very limited facilities out on the island. And if you have a medical emergency, there is a doctor there, but the supplies just take so long to get there. You need something that can go fast, and essentially the catch is it has to be cheap. At the stages when you have a drone pilot there, it's never going to be as cheap as a guy on the boat. But that was super interesting. It wasn't all smooth sailing, but it was just really satisfying seeing the technology being created, used, and actually having a positive impact. And that whole kind of arc was just super inspiring, really got me excited, and I guess kind of made me turn towards some more interesting uses of technology, I guess, after that.
So I guess it was a good case study for using drones in those sort of landscapes with those communities. Like you said, when people often talk about drone delivery, think about drone delivery, they skip to images of Amazon delivering takeaway or whatever it might be, something Prime deliveries,
your burritos flying into your house and things. Yeah,
exactly. But as with many things, there's probably more important problems to solve early on, even though it's a bit chicken and egg, because often there's more money being thrown at these novelty ends of the spectrum. So, but yeah, really interesting way to get to learn that environment, I guess. And was that where you started to have thoughts and ideas about how drones could be used for other uses in those kind of ecosystems?
Yeah. I think like even just for me, it was also really interesting seeing, it was my first time in Africa and in like a lower income country as well. And seeing that, some things that you don't typically associate. So like the drones was kind of a new thing, but then I was also at someone's wedding and they were also flying a drone to film. Like my parents' weddings definitely didn't have a drone flying. Like the technology is being caught up really fast. And in those days as well, like what impressed me was seeing that it wasn't like technology is something we only use in the West or more developed countries. The people in lower income countries are using it in some cases faster. Like Tanzania has this system called M-Pesa, which is this mobile phone based money transfer system. And that started in 2010s and well before all these apps were transferring money. And that really impressed me. And so that really made me think, like technology doesn't have to be expensive or fancy and things. There can be ways of using it to generate an impact that is, really scalable, really cheap, and can be used by anyone on the planet. The catch is it just needs to be bringing a value to them. So that's the case of, the drone filming someone's wedding. It's not crazy expensive and it brings, massive value to the photographer. And same with this M-Pesa. The $50,000 delivery drone, not so much probably for that, but so that definitely made me think more about how to apply technology to these kind of problems, but in a way that's sustainable and that it's not just, for 1% of the world. It's something that can be used everywhere in that sense. So,
and that, was it at that point where you started to have ideas of kind of how a business might evolve around this? Were there other steps between that work you were doing out in Tanzania and going on to found Inverto? Where did that idea come from,
probably a couple more steps, I guess.
Yeah.
Like I'd always since being a child, I was always out playing in the garden and things. Like as at primary school, like every lunchtime and morning tea, I'd go play with ants and, try and keep them so I could keep the same ants and things. So I was always really fascinated by the environment and by particularly animals and biodiversity and things. And also growing up, it was something, always seeing a new stretch of development and things. And that was something always close to my heart I wanted to do something about. But and it never really came to my mind, even at university or while at this startup, about, starting my own business. That it always felt like, I could join another company having the impact I want to have and, have an impact that way. But then I joined this NGO in Switzerland, robotics. And that's where I met Jörg, my co-founder. Right. And there it was a bit working on similar problems, again, not so much building the drones themselves, but customizing them for special use cases, including medical delivery. Or the main project we worked on together was actually releasing live mosquitoes to combat dengue fever.
Wow.
Super interesting application. The project itself was really interesting as well. They were I learned more about mosquitoes than I ever thought I would in my life. So tell me if you want to stop hearing about mosquitoes. But
no, carry on.
Yeah, different to a lot. There's many different groups basically releasing mosquitoes to fight dengue fever. There's ones that release genetically modified ones that release sterile ones that only release male mosquitoes that are sterile and things like this. This particular group uses a method it's a World Mosquito Program based out of Melbourne, And they work in many different countries, and it's a very interesting technique because they essentially release mosquitoes that are the same as the mosquitoes in the wild. They capture a portion of the wild population and infect them with a bacteria called Wolbachia, which you find in about 60% of insects worldwide anyway. But if you can get it into the population of mosquitoes, it stops mosquitoes carrying dengue and reduces their ability to transmit yellow fever and a few other diseases as well. It doesn't wipe out the mosquitoes or anything, which is what a lot of the other techniques do. And the really nice thing is, I mean, not from a business perspective, but just in terms of impact, if you can get enough of this bacteria into the wild population, it stays in the wild population, is spread between the generations, and you essentially block the spread of dengue. All the other kind of mosquito release techniques to fight dengue, which rely on population suppression, you have to keep coming back. You have to keep reducing the population. And the more I look into it as well, a native mosquito almost doesn't exist anywhere in the world. You find this Aedes aegypti mosquito, which carries dengue. Part of the issue is that it's spread everywhere with people, and that's why it's even replacing some native populations of mosquitoes, which actually turn out to be quite important pollinators for a lot of species, which is something I also never knew.
Wow, I should know that, but yeah.
Yeah, so when people talk about, wiping out mosquitoes having no negative impact, there definitely would be a negative impact. I mean, some mosquitoes are less, don't pollinate, some do. Some are crucial pollinators, some plants rely on mosquitoes. There's even a type of mosquito that feeds only from the nectar secreted by a specific species of ant. So they basically come up to these ants and just collect the nectar off the back of these ants, and that's what this species of mosquito survives across. But anyway,
that's amazing.
But anyway, so I was at this NGO working on basically robotics for social good, and that's where I met Jörg. And we had been approached by some people because we were kind of specialized in releasing live mosquitoes, in releasing other kinds of things like to restore ecosystems. And we were following these groups doing drone planting of trees and things, and we always found that super cool. We thought that would be awesome if we could get more into this. And then we started to look at we're the typical engineers. We look at everything as an engineering thing, and at that stage, we were seeing it. Okay, we could build things to help planting go much more efficiently. So that's why we looked at mangroves in particular, very high impact ecosystems essentially, in terms of carbon, in terms of biodiversity, and the social impact as well. And we started to think, well, could there be a business building specialized systems to restore coastal ecosystems? And that's kind of the initial idea of Inverto, as focusing on the technology. But then as we started, we saw, well, just being able to plant more mangroves doesn't solve the core issues here. But that's kind of how it began.
So, I mean, the ecosystem, that mosquito story is actually really interesting, and I should definitely. I mean, this is what's fascinating about biodiversity and nature, is that even as someone that works in the field, every day almost, it feels like I'm learning about some other cool animal or adaptation out there. And when you link it into the ecosystem services that they provide, to use that term, as you said before, whether it's pollination or whatever it might be, then it suddenly starts to tell an even more impactful story. So I love that as an analogy. And so on the mangroves then, what makes them such a powerful solution, or for so many different of these, talking about ecosystem services, what makes mangroves so powerful? Just to give a little bit of a background for people out there who are unaware of the power of this ecosystem.
So I mean, mangroves, to be specific, they're essentially the words used to describe almost any kind of tree that grows in these brackish intertidal areas. So there's around 11 to 30 or something different species of mangroves, but they're not necessarily related as trees. So you even have what's called the mangrove palm, completely unrelated to the typical red or grey mangroves and things like this. But they all fit in a similar kind of environmental niche. And it's one of these things, I don't know if it's, I actually don't know why this is, that trees that fill this particular niche have this particular ability, but most mangrove species sequester carbon, for example, much faster than even terrestrial rainforests and things like this. So there's a huge range. It depends on the exact ecosystem, but around 4 to 6 times faster than a terrestrial ecosystem. And they sequester a lot more, and a lot more of that carbon goes into their roots. They have a very large root mass, and essentially that means a lot of the biomass is not just above ground, which when the tree dies, as all trees eventually do, means it gets released to the environment again. It's actually put into the soil through the roots and through other methods, so that's a lot more permanent as well, because that's one of the not issues, but when you talk of a typical forest, it's when we're talking about carbon permanence, it's not quite as long, because as soon as a tree dies, it goes back up. You always have new trees growing and things, and it's a cycle. And as long as you have a lot of biomass, that's essentially stored. But it's not permanent in the same way that, coal is. Once, coal and oil, that's permanent carbon storage, but until you dig it up and burn it, and that's the same. But so the studies I've seen for mangrove carbon permanence is upper levels around 500 years, but people still aren't fully sure. So on the climate aspect, really interesting ecosystems. And then you also have the fact that they're typically in quite biodiverse areas. They're affecting not just the animals on land, but also animals in the water. So you're affecting kind of two ecosystems at once. And in addition to this, so there are a few products that people collect from mangroves, but none that are really important commercially. There's there's actually a cookbook you can find, which is about 30 different recipes from mangrove products, which is super interesting.
Nice. We talked about over a beer once, didn't we? The mangrove drink that we may create one day.
Yeah. Actually, I've been doing some experiments around that. I can add in a bit.
Brilliant. We'll come back to that.
Yeah. But so there are some products, but they're never really commercially important. But what's really valuable with mangroves from a social level is they really help fix coastlines in place. I mean, coastlines this is also something I never really knew before until I started looking into it. They're always a bit dynamic. I mean, even if you have mangroves, if the conditions are there to cause erosion, mangroves will just slow it down, but they'll still get eroded if, for example, you don't have enough sediment coming down the river or things like this, or if the waves are too strong. But mangroves will slow it down, and they will also help expand the land if the conditions are there and things like this. So it's particularly important when you have things like storm damage or tsunamis. In a lot of these kind of Pacific countries where this is a real issue, it actually has a measurable economic benefit to have this coastal protection that protects crops and villages and things like this. And even I was reading about, so in Aceh in Indonesia, which was completely devastated by this massive tsunami in 2004, areas that had more mangrove forests were a lot better protected. And even it started to get even things like coffee companies interested in mangroves, not because mangroves affect coffee production, but it affects how coffee gets from the highlands to the ports. And if the roads are in a better condition, it's better for the coffee companies in that sense. So after that, actually, there was huge government programs in Indonesia to try and restore the mangroves as quick as possible all over the country, with varying levels of success. But so essentially, that's why we focused on mangroves and these types of coastal ecosystems, because we were saying, well, if we are going to focus ourselves on restoring like one unit of area of any ecosystem, this is about the highest impact we can have. And that's
Nice. I mean, it's good to start with a real focus, I think, when building anything, or it can, particularly with how different and the different complexities of ecosystems and the different human elements and you need to bring into all these things. I think focusing on just one ecosystem first of all is a really smart move. And mangroves
and one ecosystem is complicated enough.
I know
already,
exactly.
so.
Right. And it was, so I guess, sorry, lost my train of thought there. And you're looking at areas that have been damaged, or you're looking to create in completely new areas. Is that because you've explained the potential benefits for flood alleviation, things like that? Are you primarily focusing first of all on areas where mangroves have been lost, putting them back, or are you even looking at creating brand new mangroves in areas where they weren't there before? And what is the main driver, I guess, for the loss of those mangroves that were there originally and are no longer there?
Yeah, so I guess to begin with the main drivers, so there's many different drivers, but some of the biggest are actually, well, yeah, the expansion of aquaculture, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, Indonesia, and things like this. Because until around the 60s or 70s, these lands were really marginal. You can't use them because they're salty. You can't use them for traditional farming, things like this. They were used for fishing a lot, and they're really productive in terms of fishery production. But until around the 60s or 70s, there's this massive expansion of aquaculture farming, fish farming, shrimp farming, things like this. And that can use this, what was previously marginal land quite, in a commercially productive way. So that really led to an explosion in, the degradation of mangrove environments around Southeast Asia, but in many other countries as well. Like even in Australia, there's, I've seen some shrimp farms, which are basically, old mangrove swamp and things. And I mean, it's also, like in Australia, a lot of the degradation comes also from development pressures, building of new ports or new places to live. Actually, so where I'm from on the Gold Coast, there's huge areas which used to be essentially swamps or mangrove forests. And in the 50s and things, swamps and mangrove forests were always associated with disease, or really, like, people didn't want them at all. They smelt, things like this. I think I read a report from a naturalist, and I'll have to find this quote. It's a great quote, basically saying how horrible mangroves are. Like, worst environment. They smell bad. There is no benefit to a human, and best thing is to stay away from them, essentially. So that, I guess that's still kind of the thought. I mean, in many places, it's still the thought. So that led to the draining of these swamps for new housing developments and stuff like this. So they're probably some of the biggest pressures towards that. And I mean, you're never going to clear houses to put mangroves back, but a lot of these essentially aquaculture farms, they have lost productivity, and some of them are being abandoned, things like this. And that's really prime sites for mangrove restoration, because they don't even have an economic benefit anymore. They've just been abandoned, forgotten about, and now they're just an area which, I mean, once you can restore the conditions, the mangroves will restore quite readily, because it is such a prime site. So there, even typically, you don't need to do planting or things like this. You just need to ensure that the pressures are removed and ensure that the hydrology and things, the flow of water is sufficient, but it will restore itself. So in some of those areas, in other areas when there's been a storm or a large change in conditions, I mean, there was an area of around 20,000 hectares in northern Australia that was actually lost just because of, there was a few years where the sea level was actually a little bit lower. I'd have to look at exactly why for 2 or 3 years the sea level was a little lower. I think it was to do with the tides in that region for those years, but it led to a massive dieback. And then once you have a dieback at those scales, it doesn't recover readily without some kind of intervention. So these are kind of highest priorities. We also have had discussions with groups in places like the UAE and Saudi. And then the question is more about, they want to create new ecosystems where mangroves maybe weren't historically. And that's it's one we're always thinking about. In that case, it's considered even more of like a garden. It's not necessarily the restoration of nature, but these coastlines are so changed anyway. It's hard to define what pristine nature is there. Like when you're talking about all these artificial islands and things like this. So it's there's money behind it, so it's on our table, let's say. But I wouldn't say it's where our heart is necessarily the most behind.
Yeah, I can relate to that gardening comment, being from the UK, and people talk about habitat restoration, and there's this look of confusion amongst even ecologists because no one can even agree what the landscape really should look like. And even if it should look like that, it's been we have to interact on a small island with so many people and other pressures that can we even restore habitats fully to a function, to how they would have functioned in the past. So that point around gardening is an interesting one because on the one hand we don't want to be over managing ecosystems, and we want them to function in a natural way. We want to be part of them as part of nature, right? But the unfortunate reality is that actually we do still need to balance the landscape scale restoration with a bit of gardening here and there, right? That point around the development pressures is really interesting in Australia, and just the different reasons for the destruction of these habitats in the first place. And I've talked about this on the podcast before with other guests, the way we valued nature, and again coming back to those ecosystem services, has been obviously way too low. And the way that the economic systems are set up, the thing that is more profitable to do usually wins out, whether it's development or it's aquaculture or whatever it might be. We're finally seeing a change in some of the talk, at least, around how we should be valuing nature much higher, and it should be above and beyond those other things, because we can't have a functioning society without nature in place. So it's a big topic. We would love to get your thoughts and feelings on how you're seeing that changing, if it is all just talk still, or if we are starting to see a change in the way that we interact and value nature. And obviously that's a big part of behind what you're creating at Inverto, is the hope that whether it's companies or even individuals are willing to start to put more finance into nature and value it alongside, if not above, these other uses, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, super interesting question. It's definitely a hard. It's a complex topic, right? Like, it's one of those things, and I think it's just there's a lot of historical kind of momentum behind it to a large extent. If you imagine, the way we're treating nature, it would be sustainable if we were still, the same population we had 500 years ago. It wouldn't be. It's just, as there's more of us, we have to be a lot more careful, especially, we're not the only things on the planet, and if we keep this up, we're going to end up being the only things on the planet, and I don't think that's going to be good for anyone. And that's, I think just that kind of, it's a historical view. I mean, if you look at like the first, and I guess in Europe it's also a bit different, because I think I remember reading, it's the impacts of humans on the ecology in Europe is way before anyone can remember. But in a place like in Australia or the US and things, a lot of the more modern impacts of humans is quite visible, and it's all been measured. And so with some of the Australian government targets around or definitions for a pristine environment, they're looking at trying to use the pre-1788 whatever records they had from James Cook and these kind of voyages to set that as a standard for a pristine environment, which is something you couldn't do at all in Europe. Like in Switzerland, for example, where I currently live, a pristine environment is considered, one that also includes cows and sheep and things, which are, I mean, if you go back far enough, they're not native species, they're introduced, and the species themselves have been changed a lot from their wild form. So it's a very complicated topic in that sense. But I think now that what's different today is we are able to have this long-term view. We can look back at history and we can see what things have worked. We can see what things aren't going to work, and we're able to look forward a lot better. And we can see quite clearly, like a lot of the practices that we were doing in the 60s and 70s, the Rhine River in Europe was red at some point. It caught on fire several times. Like that was, it seems like now really, really obvious, but somehow at the time, just dumping chemicals in the river was perfectly normal. And yeah, that's something we have caught on and we have fixed, and now you can swim in that river. That's amazing. And I'm sure the Thames in London, I mean, has improved a lot. Like they're going to swim in the Seine in Paris this year.
Yeah,
That's quite crazy.
it's crazy to think, really. I mean, although I've heard that it may still not pass the test, but it's getting there.
Oh, but it's amazing that people can even consider it. That's a lot of progress, I would say. And I guess it's also this like this. I guess you've discussed this topic before. This idea of a shifting baseline, like it's very easy to think like, yeah, okay, what's baseline? Okay, well, baseline is, a city of this size and this many people and things. But my grandparents wouldn't have seen a city like this. They would have seen animals that I'll never see, for example, and things like this. And yeah, that's very hard to keep track of, I guess. Well, conceptualize.
And yeah, you mentioned something quite interesting in one of your comments when I was chatting to you before this around you worked in Vanuatu, is that right?
Yes.
And
yeah.
I thought that was, and you mentioned how the people there have a different idea of how to value things, or they don't really have the same economic system or system of money. And I guess this is again why it gets quite complicated working in this space, because we're trying to work, or the thinking is that to get the change we want to see, we have to speak the economic language of the developers, or the aquaculture companies. We need to speak their language so they can understand that it's more valuable to keep these ecosystems or to restore them than it is to keep destroying them. But I thought that story about Vanuatu and the way that they approach things was a nice reminder that not there's still people that don't think in that system. And how do you think we do balance these different ways of thinking when we talk about something like nature? Because it's a complicated one, and I don't expect you to have the answer, but it's just an interesting topic to think about.
It's like, it's like there's a lot of talk these days about, regenerative agriculture as if it's something new, but that's actually almost the normal status of agriculture for most of humanity until we started to industrialize production of fertilizers and things like this. And so that's what I found really. So to go back to Vanuatu, so the people there, their gardens, which was providing all their food, and for which they didn't have any need to pay for food necessarily. They could pay for things like if they wanted tinned tuna or something a bit out of the normal, but they were very self-sufficient on their islands and things, and that's how they've always been. And they can still remember. It's a very kind of like, from in my family to go back until people were self-sufficient is a few more 100 years basically. And they were almost shocked to think, okay, but you have to earn money just to eat. That's a strange system. And for them, their gardens, it was always impressive, just looked like bits of forest, and they just had the right plants growing, more or less managing themselves. They were, that's something that you're never going to feed a city the size of London or Paris with systems like that. But there's definitely a lot you can learn from these types of systems as well. If you want to feed a city the size of London or Paris for the next 1,000 years, it needs to be a process a bit more regenerative in that aspect. So
and it's just fascinating. I think I guess that was before you were working on it Inverto, but it sounds like you've had experience working with other communities as well in Pakistan and other countries. I mean, is that a topic you often find yourself discussing with them in terms of where the money is coming from for these projects and how that fits into how they view nature and how their communities view things?
Yeah, that's something. Like everyone, there's so many different ways of seeing it and things. And especially in a lower income country, the most important thing for people is to eat, provide for their family and things like this. And in a place like Vanuatu, they're very lucky to have a very functioning ecosystem that just provides them a lot of food without a lot of additional effort in that sense. But in places more like Pakistan or Indonesia, where there's a lot more people and farming a lot more intensively, it's a lot harder for them to kind of get enough to eat. And then looking at, well, to eat or to get the same kind of standard of living that someone in Europe or something is used to. And so then I can imagine, so we've mentioned it, and it always seems to sound a bit foreign to, the people who live in these environments. That, there's people in Europe who are very happy to pay these guys money to plant a tree. And they'll be like, well, if I'm going to get money, that's great. But why would you pay for a tree you'll never see? Like, it's a very foreign concept, but they do see the value of these forests and these ecosystems. So they're very happy to support it, but it's like, until people have all their basic needs met, it's, protecting the environment so that it stays the same for the next 100 years is always going to be the next, like, lower down on their list of priorities. Yeah.
You've tapped into a fascinating potential topic there in terms of where the finance is coming from, I guess. And I'd love to dig into that a bit more and your current thinking and how it's evolving over time, because I imagine as a startup and in this space, you're constantly evolving and adapting and changing your mindset on how you approach this. I mean, when you started Inverto, did you have a clear idea of the types of areas you were looking to generate that revenue from? I know that there's a lot of, and I'm only just finding this out, I didn't quite realize how much work there is already going on in the carbon space in mangroves, and mangroves are quite a common project in a blue carbon space. So I know you mentioned that you're keen to not have carbon tunnel vision, which is something that I think a lot of companies are guilty of. So, but have you explored that as a potential financial model? And what are your thoughts on it's a big topic, we could talk about it for hours, I'm sure, but carbon markets, the ability of carbon markets to finance nature restoration, the potential pros and cons of that, and what do you think may be a better option if you have one?
So I mean, when we first started, we were our business model essentially was to sell technology to groups restoring mangroves as carbon projects, essentially. For us, the reason why we shifted away from that is, for one, we were focusing only on the planting side, and that's never the main pain point in such projects. And also, then it's all about, doing it as cheaply as possible, looking only at the carbon side. So then it's about, how many trees can you fit in the ground? Which ones are going to sequester the most carbon and things like this. And in terms of the pros and cons of the carbon market, I mean, the pro is it's the only thing we have today that's really bringing money to growing forests and growing ecosystems like this, which is, that's super valuable. That's not something to be ignored. And I think that the downside of it is it's only looking at one metric, and it's only rewarding one metric. And the value of a forest isn't that one metric. Like, we should have, we rely on forests and nature and things, not just for climates, to keep our planet cool and things like this. We rely on them as well for pollination, for providing all these kinds of medical compounds in our drugs, even like keeping our food supplies working and things like this. They're a lot more complicated, but if we had ways of really having those as metrics and things to support projects in that sense, or even biodiversity itself. I mean, it's super complicated in terms of how you measure it or how you can look at it. But that's really the value of growing a forest. The value of the forest is so much more than just the carbon. The carbon is almost like a footnote, but that's the thing that brings the money in. So that's kind of what we want to do with Inverto is really make these other benefits easy to communicate, super engaging. At this stage, the biggest value that can bring to one of our companies is mostly from the marketing angle, which sounds a bit cynical, but if that can bring the funding to these projects, then that's what we're going to take. But we see, everyone agrees we should be putting more money into nature, and it's just, okay, well, how do we do this? Just paying for carbon, I mean, it's a start, it's great, but it leads to, projects where you try and grow monocultures of eucalyptus in Africa or things like this, which, I mean, good for carbon, but not good for much else. Yeah.
I mean, that's, I guess, there's the pros and cons of a market. One is that it makes money flow. The other is that people find a way to try and shortcut it. And decide, what's the quickest way to generate the most income, right? Just as you said. And it's interesting to look back on it now, because yes, that solved one potential issue of carbon, but it completely it missed an opportunity in terms of all the biodiversity benefits that we could have from a bigger project. And it seems like things, or not just biodiversity, but other, again, to come back to the ecosystem services point, whether it's flood or storm damage, alleviation, or whatever it might be, loads of other benefits you could do from doing a more holistic project. So I agree, it's the only mechanism we have, and it's good. We should not let good be the enemy of perfect, but it's there's so much more that can be done. And the thing I always talk about, as well as you said there, the PR, there's a lot of money coming in from philanthropy. I mean, philanthropy is nothing new into nature, and I guess the movement is away from just a tokenistic donation to something that's a bit more of a measurable and certain outcome, right? And that's what carbon started to do, in a way, of putting some kind of measurement on that impact. But now we're in this next phase of trying to put measurements, as tricky as that might be in some cases, on biodiversity as well, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, it's never going to be like, that's the thing. It's never going to have a single metric like you can have for carbon. And even if you can condense it to a kind of index, it's never going to be meaningful to compare it between ecosystems and things like this. So it's, but we do have ways of measuring it, or specific aspects of it. And, maybe it can't be unitized in the same way, but we can show impact. We can show the benefit and really make sure that it is having these positive impacts in terms of, like, ecosystem services, how it's protecting nature and restoring it and things like this. So I think, moving towards, methods that can finance impact in that sense, and in a broader scope than just paying for units of a certain index or tons of carbon in that sense. Yeah.
And the storytelling power of nature, right? I mean, it's an interesting thought I've been having a lot recently, in terms of how much can we rely on the carrot versus the stick. How quickly do we need to move to a world where we're telling companies, or telling even individuals, how they should be mitigating their impacts, setting rules. And we're starting to see this in the UK, for example, and in Australia as well, where laws are coming in to tell companies that they have to start measuring and mitigating and compensating for the impacts that they're having. So I'm interested to get your thoughts on that. Like, if we jump too quickly to that, do we potentially miss out on actually some of the good potential reasons to give money to things for the right reasons, for that kind of to give back, to be part of something bigger, to be part of an impactful project? Where do you sit on that, and how do we find the right balance, I guess?
I mean, it's super interesting, I guess. Like, you have exactly this. You have these two kind of angles, and I mean, like, it's amazing that both angles are growing. Like, there is more and more pressure on the regulatory side on companies to do stuff. That always seems to be, very broad strokes, but at least it gets kind of the slow movers doing stuff. But then, I mean, and this is the whole reason I guess it's happening from a government side, it's this pressure within society itself. And that leads really on this kind of, more carrot side for companies. If you're a fashion label or any kind of consumer brand, these days, sustainability has to be a key part of your image. You can't be seen to be you don't want to have factories pouring chemicals into the river anymore. Like, that's just not an option. And that's just from how society looks at nature these days, and how much more is being reported on that side just on a voluntary basis. And that, I think, is super valuable. But the risk is with all this stuff is like, kind of incentivizes going for the very charismatic stories and things like this. Like, if you're a company that wants to support the conservation of a species, you're going to protect the cute pandas or the orangutans. You're not going to go necessarily for the mosquitoes, which could be really important for the
I think we'd struggle to get that one off the starting block. Unfortunately, we've got a way to go with the mosquitoes image.
But so that's a bit, and that's where I see, I guess, the regulatory side should be at least a bit more rounded. So it's ensuring that, like, we have support for, soil microorganisms and things, not sexy at all, but incredibly important. So how we can support that in a more holistic way. That's a great problem that we need a solution for, I guess.
How is that in your thinking in terms of trying to tell the story? Because while we are still in that space, and I agree, I think it's going to be a little of column A, a little from column B. Have you started thinking about how you can use tech, being an engineer and approaching this with an engineer's mind? Like, there's some cool innovation going on. I've heard of companies listening to soil. That point you mentioned there on how can we make soil microbes a charismatic species? Maybe it's listening to them and telling people to I know you're working with different innovative tech at Inverto. Like, what are you bringing in, and what have you got some interesting kind of case studies in terms of the stories that you can tell with that tech?
So the way we see it is like, this is actually the big opportunity with biodiversity compared to a ton of carbon, which you can't see. It's colorless, odorless. You can't even imagine it so easily. Biodiversity is incredibly visible. It's something you can relate to on a very emotional basis. So that's kind of our goal, to help communicate biodiversity and nature in a way that is, very narrative. You can follow the story of these restoration projects and see it in a very engaging way. So for that, the stuff we're working with is some stuff kind of off the shelf. So exactly these, acoustic monitoring, which can be really powerful for vocal species, essentially. And that we can even get, at this stage, we're just looking at detecting the presence of birds. And we'll see if we get many frogs, but that's, we'll find out. But at least that'll tell us the presence of species. The long-term vision would be amazing if also we can get an idea of what the species are doing there. Are they nesting? Are they feeding? All this kind of stuff. But further down the road, camera traps also kind of off the shelf, but then you get a visual picture that you can show. And with this, you have a high confidence that an animal is actually there in the project. Mm-hmm. And what's really exciting that we're trying to do, we haven't yet implemented in one of our projects, but that's something I'm personally really excited about, is using environmental DNA. So I guess you've come across this, but just the way that you're able to take a sample of the soil or of the water or even of the air and get already a list of the species in the area, that's crazy, and it's extremely scalable. The main thing holding it back is the high lab analysis costs. But that seems to be dropping quite quickly. So I'm hopeful that that's going to be a lot more accessible in the future. And then once we have ways to collect these samples at a really scalable way, so that's something where we're developing, and hopefully we'll be testing out later this year, but a way to automate the collection of these samples using drones and things. So there's actually an amazing group from ETH in Switzerland, working on the Biodiversity X Prize, doing really cool stuff, collecting environmental DNA with drones in the Amazon.
Nice. That's
great group
so
of people.
cool.
And seeing with one of these environmental DNA samples, you can just you get, okay, again, it doesn't capture everything, but you can capture just such a range of species, and you can get data on, you know, the unsexy ones, the microbes in the soil and stuff, that you can get the data on in a really scalable way. And yeah, that's like for people trying to find rare or elusive species, it seems really exciting. I was watching a talk even, and they were going through quite comprehensively some of the samples they were collecting. And the really interesting thing is there's still about 20%, so in some of the samples, I have to remember where this was, so it's still about 20 to 30% of that DNA, they just didn't know what it was. It's animals or microbes or things that aren't properly classified or fully discovered. So there's so much more we can find out here.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Environmental detective work. It's the DNA stuff is fascinating, and there's going to be no silver bullet, as you kind of hinted towards there, but the combination of all those things, they just provide different tools and different insights. And there's going to be some things that are more towards the scientific end, which is super important. Without the proper data and the reliable and transparent data, then we risk the greenwashing and all that side of things, which is super important. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got, as you said, camera traps are so powerful for telling a story that we can all relate to. Many of us, most people in the UK, I think grew up at least watching some David Attenborough. So you've got those two different ends of the spectrum in terms of data collection, but equally important and can tell different parts of the story. And I'm seeing a lot of really cool work being done on the storytelling side, getting that data and telling the story to different audiences in a way that they can connect with, right? So whether it's a scientist you're talking to who wants to know about the data and wants to scrutinize the data down to the and we can sometimes go too far with that as ecologists, but and then, you know, just the general public, or if it's a company investing in it, maybe it's their staff or their C-suite that want to know about what their money's going towards. So that's where it gets fascinating. I think we're finally getting there as an industry, understanding that it is about the storytelling as much as it is about the data, and it can't be one or the other, right?
It's this sales process, right? Like you gotta I think also what's going to be really interesting in this space is, as we're getting all this data, I mean, like modeling it and actually inferring things from it is going to be really powerful. So one of our goals is really to use this detection of species data using a range of methods, but combine it with, for example, the high resolution drone imagery, which tells us a lot about what species of plant are where. And the dream is to really model out the distribution of species at a fine resolution. So people can say, okay, these plants are coming back. So concretely, the habitat for this species is expanding by 10 square meters or something like this. And we know this because of this. We've detected the species, and this is a model that, and so on. And then, you know, that's not only going to be amazing for tracking the progress and the impact in terms of biodiversity of these types of restoration projects, but also kind of predicting the effects of future changes. For example, like if we see a change to sea level could cause the distribution of this plant to reduce, or at higher temperatures, we're expecting to have the mean altitude of this plant, for example, to go up or something like this. Then we could extrapolate from that. Then that's going to affect a bit like these other species and things, because we've developed these models. I mean, these ecosystems are always super complex, so it's never going to be a perfect science, but we're starting to get a lot more information around it, and hopefully we can start to understand these complex systems a bit better. But
it's I mean, it is always going to be complicated. That's the way it is. And I mean, we getting comfortable with that is key, but also understanding that we do have really good, reliable ways of measuring things. And again, it's just finding that balance, and then not forgetting that it's also a human problem, and that we have to make sure that we're working with the right people who understand what the ecosystem is, and have way more knowledge than anyone from outside will ever will. And you mentioned it before, and it's so key, is it's providing tools and providing ways to just allow wherever in the world it might be, whatever communities, you might be working with to access these new potential revenue streams, right? Which is what you're doing so well.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to go into the entrepreneur side of things, the ecopreneur side of things a little bit. Unless there's anything, just quickly, if you want to, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground there, but was there anything else from the kind of technical side of things that you wanted to talk about, or are you happy to move on?
No, happy to move on.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, on the building a company, then building a business, it's a big focus of this podcast, and something that the reason I started it was to try and inspire more people to start businesses and get started in this space, because we need as many people working on solutions as possible. So, first of all, kudos to getting stuck in and getting started on this challenge. I'm sure it's been an interesting journey so far already. I mean, I was intrigued to know, it's always fascinating to me when someone approaches from a different background to, say, a strictly nature background or an ecology background. Like, you're coming from more of an engineering, robotics background. Do you think that's brought you any advantages or different mindsets to this space, and how has that helped you potentially approach being a founder and an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, like, with any kind of successful venture, you need to have diversity of viewpoints. So, I mean, like, yeah, there's a value to being an engineer, especially when it's bringing in a different viewpoint to what you'd have purely from the ecology side. But, the engineer alone is never going to solve everything either. So it needs to have these different perspectives. And so I've been really thankful that I've been able to talk to a lot of people with strong ecological backgrounds to really, help round out the kind of things that we're doing. In terms of, I think, we've been talking a bit in like the more stereotypical startup space and things, and there, it's almost like a benefit to show, an engineer are more like the typical startup type people, and then, you can emphasize the technology and things, and that can sound better from certain angles to, have the engineering background. But I think at the end of the day, I mean, what I do day to day isn't that much engineering anymore. It's like having the overview is super helpful and being able to make connections and things. But the key thing is just, and it doesn't matter what your background is, even someone who hasn't done professional training and things. I've seen amazing people starting businesses without going to university and stuff, but just having that passion, getting stuck in, having an open mind, and understanding that you may not be the expert, but talking to people who are experts and bringing that together and connecting it, that's, from what I see, really the key thing, less than a particular background. A particular background helps a lot within that space, but the key to moving forward is making the connections and accessing the things you don't know, because you never will know everything.
I mean, maybe you're just being modest, Cameron, but I was thinking it was that you hinted to it there, is that in the entrepreneurial journey, just being adaptable, having a tinkering mindset. It feels like that kind of it does fit in quite well with an engineer or robotics, in terms of, understanding that things will break and things won't quite work, and then you adapt, and then you kind of tinker away and adapt until things kind of start to fall into place.
Maybe it also helps almost like not understanding certain things well, because then you always think, oh, that sounds easy. Like growing mangroves. You just have to plant them. That sounds easy. And then you give it a shot and you find out, okay, no, it's a bit more complicated than that, but then you're already stuck into it and you have to keep going. So
I think it's we need more different mindsets approaching these problems, different combinations, lots of collaboration, because for too long, I think as an ecologist, we've been trying to solve these problems as just ecologists, and not understanding why we're not progressing or failing to connect with certain audiences. So I think as many different perspectives as possible is key. And in terms of your journey so far with the company, like, what are some of the biggest challenges you've faced, in terms of, some I'm sure were expected, but any kind of unexpected ones, or anything, for any advice, I guess, for potential wannabe founders out there who are thinking about starting a company in this space or in the impact space?
Yeah. I think, yeah. So probably the challenge at the beginning was that we kind of thought that we knew what we were doing, or we knew what the problems were. And that took us probably even too long to learn in that case. And I think the key learning I would say that I've had from this is, the more you talk to people and the more diverse they are, the more you can understand the problem you're trying to solve, and the more you can come up with better things. And literally, if you think you know a solution, ask 100 people, 100 people. It'll be weeks of time, but if you can talk to 100 people about something and get 100 different opinions on it, you'll come out with something really strong at the end. That's I'm quite convinced around that. And opinions, everyone's got an opinion. No one's going to have the right opinion. So that's why if you only listen to 3 people and one person tells you one thing and you think, oh, well, that makes sense, but then you talk to 100 and only one person tells you that one thing, then you'll be like, okay, well, you always have to value it and understand why they're saying that thing as well. People have their reasons behind saying things and they could be really legitimate. But it also could be that, maybe they just don't know the space that much, or they made a wrong assumption. So talk to more people, get more opinions. It's never a drawback if you spend a whole day talking.
Yeah.
Oh, not talking, but listening. That's much more important. Yeah.
I was about to say, don't just talk. That's really, really useful advice. And in terms of you're in Switzerland, right? You're based in Switzerland.
Yeah.
So was that a kind of more of a convenience thing, or did you think I have heard of a lot going on in the nature world in Switzerland. You mentioned the ETH work that's going on out of Zurich and things like that. So was it a conscious decision, or and what is the startup ecosystem like there? Is it an interesting place to be working on this problem?
Yeah, so it is a super interesting place. So we started there mainly out of convenience, essentially. So we bought a whole bunch of workshop tools and things which are kind of inconvenient to move around, and so that's why we set up in Bern in Switzerland. And we also had a bit of a network there, and especially at the beginning we were focusing very much on the drones and the technology. Switzerland's actually a great space for that, so we knew other people with drone companies around Switzerland and things, which was super valuable. And then as we got more into it as well, the scene coming out of ETH in particular on using AI for the environment or satellite sensing and things like this is super interesting. But I mean, there's also there's a lot coming out of London as well, a lot of different places. But I'm most familiar with the scene in Switzerland these days, and I'm more and more convinced that access to these types of experts, I mean, maybe not necessarily talking about coastal restoration, that's always a bit of a stretch from Switzerland, but there's a very strong ecosystem there when it comes to using ecological data, especially, I mean, a lot of the research coming out of the Crowther lab, I guess, if you know Thomas Crowther, like a rock star in this space, but super interesting stuff. In terms of the startup scene in general, I mean, I only know the startup scene in Switzerland. I've never had a startup anywhere else, but it's really good, actually. We've had a lot of support from kind of government initiatives where we've gotten access to coaching, which has been invaluable, especially when at the beginning we just don't know what we're doing. And I think there's these programs in a lot of places, like these kinds of startup coaching programs, either from a local regional government and things, and that puts you in touch with people that have done this thing before, and that's just invaluable, just to not repeat the mistakes, or don't make the obvious mistakes, at least. Then also, some different startup accelerator programs. There's a lot, I mean, not just in Switzerland, in Europe in general, which can be really valuable. Again, for access to mentors, to coaches, also to funding and things like that as well, has been really good. We've been through some kind of startup pitching competitions, which has allowed us to get access to certain funding, or even talk to different people from different networks, which has been super valuable for us. So,
so it does sound like sound like a good place. Kind of a place that I hadn't thought about. But I guess when you think of when I think of Switzerland, I think apart from skiing and things, I
Yeah.
think of the money side of things and the finance side of things.
Yeah.
Is that linked in terms of why there's so much going on in the accelerator space? And yeah, interested to hear your thoughts. I've spoken to a couple of founders on this point in recent episodes around the decision of when to take on funding, when to start looking for funding, and the challenges that it brings when trying to work in the impact space, and potentially where investors' minds are from the tech world and Silicon Valley world, and perhaps where their expectations need to be in some of these slightly more impact ventures.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I can't say we've talked to a huge amount. The ones that we've talked to more like on the investing side has it's looked really positive. I think especially in the last 2 to 3 years, there's more of these types of like people trying to combine impact with like this startup culture kind of thing. And there's some of these venture capital firms which focuses specifically on biodiversity even. So ones like Superorganism and a couple of others, which is really, really cool to see. And that, I think, I mean, it's quite recent. And that, when you're talking to investors like that, they get it, they get the problem, and they get that, you know, you're not going to, you know, grow a forest in 6 months like you would with a typical startup company. These are, though, still quite a small subset of, if you look at the total kind of startup funding industry, I mean, pretty much all of that is dedicated to software funding, because that's the stuff that grows fast, can give you these 10x returns and stuff like that. And even if nature tech, climate tech is becoming a bit of a buzzword and a hype, there's a lot of people getting in, well, kind of coming to the space, but assuming it works a bit like the more stereotypical software approach, which it's just not the case. But I mean, yeah, these people aren't, you know, they're clever people too. They read, they learn, and so people are getting it, I think. And especially what's always refreshing is when people have a really personal connection to these types of topics. And I think that's like, for us to take on any investor, they have to be 100% aligned with our mission. That's the only way it's ever going to work for us. And yeah, that's the only way as an impact company you can be confident that you'll be having the impact you have if you have investors that are fully aligned on the mission and aren't just looking purely for the financial returns.
Yeah, I agree. There's still a way to go, but there's really encouraging signs. Superorganism are really fascinating. One, and there's others, as you say, that are popping up. I think we're getting there, and there's also just different routes and different pathways, and it's tricky to find that balance between there's the benefits of grants, but then the work that has to go in, as you said, to the competition elements of it, or the form filling elements of it, and then the potentially easier route, although might not be, it depends, of VC funding, but then the trade-offs and all that. So lots to think about, and lots of different pathways you could take. But it sounds like you've, as is the right thing to do, you focus on that, on the mission at hand, and just hope that something aligns, or bootstrapping is still a great way to go if you can make it work as well. Shouldn't be underestimated,
exactly.
right?
And I mean, like, if you really have, I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to have a sustainable business, you need to have a sustainable product that people are buying. And if you're able to already start selling things and having revenue, you don't have to sell any of your company to investors or anything. That's by far the best. If you can generate enough revenue quickly enough to be sustainable, that's
then you've got a successful business, right? Exactly.
100%. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thanks very much, Cameron. I'm going to get on to the 3 final questions that we've been wrapping up every episode with, which I hope you've done your homework on. I'm sure you have. So the first one of those questions that I've been asking all my guests is to share the love, increase the pool of potential solutions that are coming out. As I said before, we need people working on as many of these interesting ideas and solutions as possible. And I know from meeting you in the past and having a chat over food at a conference, and I don't think you're short of ideas just from that those short conversations we've had in the past. So, yeah, do you have any impact business ideas that you would like to share with the audience in the spirit of getting more of these ideas into fruition?
Yeah. So, I mean, the one that's still floating around my mind that I think we mentioned last time over some beers is I'm a big fan of mate. So, yerba mate, the Argentinian drink, either as a soft drink or even as a raw tea. And I mean, it's popular in places like Germany. I don't know how it is in the UK. Switzerland's also quite popular, but
it's just taking off, I think. But yeah, I've
okay.
seen it a lot in my travels to Germany. I know it's huge there.
Yeah. So I think in Australia, there's a big gap in the market. Someone can bring it in, and mangrove mate. So mate that restores and protects mangroves. I think it two M's in the name. It's got to work. It sounds great. And I mean, I've seen groups. There's even like, I think we also talked about, the kind of Inverto branded shirts we had that had the mangrove ecosystem on them. We always joke about, okay, maybe we become a company selling shirts, but there is actually a mangrove restoration group that is a company selling shirts. They started restoring mangroves, and they're called Mang, based out of Florida. And they're basically a merchandise company, but still dedicated to restoring mangroves by selling shirts, essentially. And they seem to make it work.
Nice. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's the key, if you can make it work. But I love those fascinating ways of making it easy to restore or do in a cool, fun way. And as long as it's measurable and can be, reported, then I'm all for it. But the mate idea, I love. You said you experimented with a few recipes as well, right?
Yeah, well, actually, so I found out you can get mate, if you get like the toasted stuff, you can make it like a latte. So in the office, I was making some mate latte, and then we also had some mangrove syrup around. So we had mangrove mate latte in the office.
Nice, as a tongue twister.
Actually, really tasty. Can recommend it. If you're ever in Bern, definitely come past and.
Nice, I will take you up on that option for sure. Brilliant, thanks for those. The next question is around books. I love to myself to read and find out about new books, whether it's on the nature or environment side of things, or whether it's on the business side of things. Anything that's on your bookshelf currently, or that you've read recently or in the past, that you'd like to recommend to listeners?
I'm actually not much of a non-fiction reader. I read pretty much only fiction. Like, if
it can be fiction, be fiction, as long as there's some kind of loose link to I'll let you have a fiction if you want.
yeah I think, well, the one that I just finished recently was, I think it's turned into a Netflix series, but I haven't seen it, but it's The Expanse. So it's about basically said in the future, humans have colonized the solar system, and then there's kind of different groups, the humans that live on Mars, the humans that live out in the asteroids and things. And it's interesting hearing about, I found it really interesting reading about, like, they're trying to describe the perspectives of humans that had never lived on Earth and how they then see people on Earth. And then, there's the ones that live out in the asteroids, always growing up in almost zero gravity and things. And they kind of see Earth as, even if Earth is super populated at that point and there's not much left, but Earth is these rich, people, they've got all the resources and things like this. So at some point, they even, they kind of attack Earth, drop some asteroids basically on it. And I found that almost unrealistic, that there was no remorse from this group of people for really destroying the only ecosystem in the solar system. I found that just unrealistic, but it's an interesting story anyway. But
nice. I actually started watching the series, but I didn't realize it was from a book. It always happens all the time. And then someone will go, "You didn't read the book," and it's much better than the series or whatever. Not that I can judge the series fully because I've not finished it, but maybe I'll start with the book instead. No, that's a really good recommendation, and thanks for giving us a fiction book as well to add to the pile, because I think I'm guilty often of reading too much non-fiction, and it's good to read a bit of fiction and switch off from the serious stuff from time to time. So thanks for that. I like it. And finally, it's the billboard question. A parting quote for a billboard to put in. Let's go for Brisbane. That's where you're from, right? If you could put a giant billboard in Brisbane to send a message out to the people there to inspire them to take action, it can be a quote of your own or it can be attributed to someone else. What would you go for?
I think, I mean, this is one you'll never have someone paying to put on a billboard, but just use less. Like, just stop assuming that you need more all the time. I think that's, yeah, if we're going to be more people on this planet, we can't just keep using more, and just in some way make, yeah, a billboard saying use less isn't going to change people's mind, but somehow making it acceptable or sexy to consume less. I think that would be my message to have to everyone on the planet, not just Brisbane.
I love that. I mean, that is the point of the billboard question: is if one
Yeah.
day I can, I do plan to do this. Hopefully, if I can find a way to fund these, then yeah,
I'll chip in if you're doing one that
nice.
says consume less or use less.
I think it could be quite a fun campaign, as you say. No company would pay for that, but it would be
No.
a stark. If you saw that in a shopping centre or whatever, it would be it would make you stop and think. So I
And
agree. That one would be a really fun one to put outside a shopping centre or something like that. So yeah, let's see
yeah,
what we can do. Let's see if we can get these up and running at some point, because I'd love to to get them out
that would
there.
be really cool.
Amazing. Well, thanks very much, Cameron. It's been a really fun chatting to you, and you would be. I love what you're working on and your energy that you bring to this. It's always good fun to chat to you. Have you got any calls to action for the audience, places they should go to find out more about what you're working on, or any links that you'd like to share for people to look up after they've finished?
Yeah, absolutely. If people want to check out our website, it's still being updated, but we should have a new one out this week, inverto.earth. Definitely subscribe. We're setting up a newsletter as well, so we can keep you updated with the progress of our pilot project in Indonesia. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, or just want to have a chat, also, you can add me on LinkedIn, reach out. I'm a friendly guy, so go right ahead. And absolute pleasure, Rob. It's been, a real a real joy talking to you, and speaking with you again. So yeah, thanks so much.
No worries.